Andrew, when you became Cabinet Secretary, did you feel you were part of an apostolic succession?
I can see why people thought that was the case, given most of my predecessors. No, I didn't, and particularly the process by which I was chosen was a selection from a number of candidates. So whereas in earlier times it was pretty much choose someone, if the Prime Minister's happy with them, then you take it and only move on to another candidate if that doesn't work. My predecessor, Richard Wilson, although he had spent time, as I like to tell him, in the Treasury as a finishing school, wasn't a Treasury person like Robin Butler or
Robert Armstrong.
And well, the fact that I've been succeeded by Gus may make it look like that again, but again there was a process.
Does that mean you're the first truly meritocratic Cabinet Secretary?
I do attach great importance to the meritocratic philosophy, given where I come from.
Grammar school boy and all that.
However, I was not the first grammar school boy. I think they will tell me that Norman Brooke was.
Norman Brooke, Wolverhampton, grammar school.
Yeah, so I wasn't a pioneer in that sense.
You knew three of your predecessors particularly well, I think, Robert Armstrong, Robin Butler and Richard Wilson. Did you pick up tips on how to do the job from them?
Yes, well, I wouldn't say tips. In the sense that I had conversations with them and they told me what to do, what not to do. But I had worked so closely with all of them. Robert Armstrong was the Cabinet Secretary in my first spell as a private secretary, number 10. And Robin
that was in the 80s with Mrs. Thatcher.
In the 80s, and Robin was the principal private secretary. I'd worked with Robin on public expenditure and in the Treasury. And then as Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, I worked closely with Richard Wilson when he was Cabinet Secretary. So it was more osmosis than picking up tips.
You all have a different style. What do you think you picked up from their styles, or don't you see it in terms of style?
I don't really think I was trying to consciously adopt a style. The style would be what was me rather than I think I will do it in a certain way. I mean, I would have done it differently from Robinson because he's a different personality, but that wasn't a conscious choice. That was genetic.
What do you think the Turnbull style is in a nutshell?
Turnbull style is quite kind of functional. I get things done, make things happen, make them work effectively, get people to come together rather than very overt extrovert leadership. I mean, there is the famous Myers-Briggs test, and I come out not just as an ISTJ, but in each of those.
What does ISTJ stand for?
Oh, in something like intuition, thinking, judgment, various character, as opposed to, no, introvert, I is introvert versus extrovert.
I see.
And, but I'm also quite an extreme version of it. So for anyone on the introvert-extrovert scale, I'm quite hard over on the I. And the opposite end, I could confidently predict if Richard Branson did it, he would get absolutely the opposite readings on each of these four scales.
There's a thought, Richard Branson as Cabinet Secretary. But we might come back to that. How great an advantage do you think it was for you to have been in the number 10 private office for two spells, the last one with John Major, through very difficult times as the principal private secretary?
No, I think that was an enormous advantage. I'd seen a lot of the Cabinet Office processes at work, the way the secretariats work, how the honours system works. I knew how number 10 worked. Yes, no, that was a big advantage.
Do you think that, having lived through several crises in your various manifestations as a senior civil servant, but particularly in number 10 in those difficult times with John Major, that your nerves are probably pretty good anyway, but do you think you've been tempered by experience to be quite good in a crisis?
Well, I think that is one of the things that the civil service prides itself on. And when there is a problem, It's not the special advisors that dig ministers out of the hole. It comes back to the civil service.
The old sweats.
Yes. Now that can be a bit of a fault in a sense that you tend to rely on the fact that you can always get yourself out of a hole. But it is an important facet, and one of the key parts to it is that the civil service is a cohesive entity, that when you have to call in something from another department, it's probably someone you were on a civil service course with 20 years ago, and you know a lot of the people, and their instinctive reaction is to respond positively to your cry for help.
Mm. And the special advisors, being temporary, can't do this, even if they're good. To the same extent, anyway. That's right. That isn't, in a sense, a criticism of them. Is that they're not there to do that job. Yeah. You were the first professionally trained economist to hold the job of Cabinet Secretary. Was that an advantage too?
Yes, it was. I'm not sure I think of myself as a professionally trained economist. I think of myself as PhD incomplete. That I did pretty well at economics. I got a first, but then I went on to this PhD, and I realised that there was a kind of glass ceiling, particularly as in the academic world. If you didn't have the maths, if all you had was O-level maths, there was a limit to how far you could go as a professional economist. But understanding the concepts is very important, and also it's a very rational subject, so it trains you in rationality. So work with 20-odd, 30-odd years in the Treasury, a spell in the IMF, it was more the way in which economists think that was relevant than mastery of the higher econometrics.
You'd also had some experience in development economics, I think, in your VSO years.
It wasn't VSO, it was the Overseas Development Institute, a very, I think, laudable, it's a fraternity. Vince Cable is probably our most famous member, Suma Chakrabarti, James Bowman, one of, I'm not sure that it was Peter or Robin Melfield's son. There were quite a lot of people who had been through this scheme. I spent 2 years in Zambia. A lot of it wasn't really working as an economist. It was just bringing some sort of administrative competence. I was the secretary of the Railway Users Committee, aged 25.
Life's been downhill since then, isn't it?
It's the purpose. This is absolutely life-saving stuff. In the dispute with Rhodesia, they would allow 100 railway trucks a week to come north, and you had to decide.
This is when Rhodesia was in rebellion.
Yes, and you had to decide whether they carried coal, maize seed, explosives, or anything else. Yeah. And they were all crying out, saying, "I need an extra 3 trucks this week," and you had to exercise some judgment and say, "Look, we do need the coal this week, but I'll see you right next week."
That is a real job.
I think it was a big advantage having served in the monetary policy division at the time of in the early 80s, and then to have spent 3 assignments on public expenditure. I felt I knew the way the public accounts were put together, and what was the definition of the borrowing requirement, how it interacted with debt. But there was also this major element or experience, which was the attempt to stay in the ERM and the failure of the ERM, but also triumphantly, in a way, which gave us 15 pretty good years, the creation of an alternative economic policy out of the ashes of the ERM.
92.
In 92. Understanding all that was all those things, an absolutely essential piece of background knowledge.
When I first knew you, picked up, I don't think you ever put it like this, a sense of shame that we'd let public expenditure get out of control for so long, so often, as a country. You didn't like that, did you?
Well, in the mid-80s, that wasn't the story at all. In the mid-80s, public expenditure was held roughly constant in real terms while the economy grew, and as a proportion of GDP, it fell quite substantially. I think the thing I regretted was we always said that finance should determine expenditure rather than the other way around. By 2007, we had committed ourselves to the view that the economy was capable of growing at 2.75%. And public expenditure, virtually the whole of it, was based on that assumption.
You never fell for that, though, personally, did you?
No, I was always sceptical. I would always have planned on a more cautious basis. It seemed to me that the government was giving itself the benefit of the doubt. What has happened since, of course, is that in early 2008, before the crisis really broke, we just had the kind of Northern Rock kind of warm-up act. We expected money GDP in 2014 to be 2,000 billion. We now think it will be about 1,650. But of course, public expenditure was planned on that basis. And you can see why it's taking so long to bring public expenditure back into line with a much reduced
revenue
economy, because the revenue itself is probably even a smaller proportion of that 1,650 than it was of the 2000. That I think there should have been a stronger grip in that period.
Can we go back now to the beginning of the century, 2001-2, when you're in the running to be Cabinet Secretary, to succeed Richard Wilson? It's the first time ever, I think, that the candidates were plural candidates in the way you described a moment ago, but also you had to put in the equivalent of a personal manifesto, how you would do the job, which horrified some of the ancients, I think.
Well,
first of all, can you remember what you put in yours?
Well, the first part of that is not correct. In '97, there were several candidates, but Prime Minister Tony Blair hadn't worked out what the process should be. And it consisted of bringing us in here to talk to him on something. Richard Wilson claims...
Because you were a runner then too, weren't you?
I was a runner then too.
Yes.
And I have to say that I don't regret not getting it at all, because it gave me the 4 years in the Treasury. He claims that he thought he was being asked about some aspect of Home Office business.
This is Richard Wilson.
Richard had no idea it was really an interview. And then the only idea Tony Blair had got was to send us off to talk to Derry Irvine.
Yeah. So he had you on the sofa first, then he sent you to Derry Irvine, the Lord Chancellor.
And I went round to see Derry Irvine. He was in his dinner jacket in the Lord Chancellor's rather splendid apartments. And he said to me, "You're a crisis man, are you?" And I thought, "Yeah, I'm in
That's
here."
Cambridge, by the way.
And we talked about Christ for about 10 or 15 minutes. And I got the impression, actually, he didn't really enjoy his time there that much, because this was the time when my elder brother, 4 times Cambridge football blue, was there. And it was full of England internationals of all sorts in all sorts of sports. And a studious law student from Glasgow wasn't really part of the dominant culture. And then I thought, I've got to get this off this subject, because I wanted to sort of lay out, what I can do with this job. And then I was just about to get it there, and he said, "Got to go off to my dinner now." So I completely blew that. So the idea of reviewing a group of candidates comes from '97. 2002 was different in the sense that it was much more systematic. There was a kind of pre-assessment by civil service commissioners, particularly Usha Bashar and David Simon, and we were all asked to put in a note on what we would do, which I've always called the prospectus.
David Simon was a minister, but also had run BP, so he was brought in to put the process on the managerial side of it all.
Yes.
Yes. So the prospectus.
The prospectus,
yes.
And it was largely about what I thought he wanted the Cabinet Secretary to do, which was about the reform of the civil service, what I thought were the changes that needed to be made, and also some structural changes in the role. There's the perennial debate about whether the job should be split or whatever.
Head of the Home Civil Service, Cabinet Secretary, and advisor on intelligence and
Right,
security. All those ingredients.
The three pieces. Anyway, he seemed to prefer my version of it and gave me the job. So
he made it plain to you he wanted you to be the delivery Cabinet Secretary, that it would be not quite in the old way of the consigliere, but it would be the deliverer of the capital.
Yes, it was very much. I mean, in the end, you have to be a consigliere on a number of issues, but he wasn't looking to his Cabinet Secretary to be a major policy advisor.
And you were happy with that?
Yes, I could make that work. Now, the other change, which I think you're probably coming on to, was that rather than the split between Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Home Civil Service, I mean, I believed I could do the job better by combining the two. The third leg of this was that the Cabinet Secretary at that point was, in a sense, the pinnacle of the intelligence and security system and the accounting officer of the secret vote, and brought together these the three agencies and their budgets. I came to the conclusion that post 9/11, the demands coming from that source were too great for it to be done on a part-time basis. I had seen two instances where I'd seen a Cabinet Secretary pulled into something that had started way back. The first was the Robert Armstrong in the what's his name?
Spycatcher, Peter Wright and Spycatcher.
Peter Wright and Spycatcher.
Yeah.
So you send your Cabinet Secretary down there to sort out an issue
to Australia,
that he hadn't spent much time on prior to that. And to some extent the same thing happened with Robin Butler and Matrix Churchill.
Which was arms to Iraq, or ingredients of arms to Iraq, to be more precise.
Now, this was helped by the fact that working almost on a kind of supernumerary basis in the Cabinet Office was David Omond, who had been the Permanent Secretary in the Home Office. He had been ill.
He'd run GCHQ too.
And he started life in GCHQ, he spent a lot of time in MOD, worked in the Home Office. Here he was in the Cabinet Office, not being fully utilised. I thought, this guy is absolutely the person to do this other job. I went to talk to the Intelligence and Security Committee, the parliamentary committee. They were a bit sniffy about this idea. But looking back on it, what has happened is that job has grown now into the National Security Advisor. So I think that the step I took was definitely the step in the right direction, and was of the various load-shedding moves I could have made to fulfil this requirement to be more kind of hands-on in civil service delivery. That, I think, was the right one to make.
Though Gus O'Donnell took it back for a while, and the National Security Advisor came back with Mr Cameron coming in.
He took back, I don't know that he took back all of it, but he certainly took back the accounting officer of the Security Service and Vote. But that didn't last, so that's why I think in the end I feel that I made the right move.
Was it a disadvantage, though, in one sense, for a while in the run-up to the Iraq War, but you weren't in charge of not in charge of, but the overseer of the intelligence world, given how central that was to all sorts of things.
If I had been the overseer of the intelligence world, I would have been sucked into the Iraq War more or less full-time and would not have been able to perform the other parts of the Cabinet Secretary's role. There was also the way in which the Prime Minister wanted to run things. He liked a much smaller group.
This is the Prime Minister's group on Iraq, as I think it was called.
Yes.
Not a formal cabinet committee.
His principal advisor would be David Manning.
And he was the Foreign Affairs
but
advisor
also by
in the Cabinet Office in number 10, yes.
I mean, the Chilcott's still to report if he ever does.
Well, I think he will one day.
But we won't be very interested in it by then.
Some of us will. Anyway, do carry on.
You've got at least 3 books to come out of it. By the time I came in September 2002, I formed the conclusion that basically the die was cast. That all the way through,
I think you were right, weren't you?
All the way through, there was a time lag between what the Prime Minister had agreed with the Americans what he was going to do and what he was telling his cabinet colleagues and what he was telling the civil service.
So the Crawford meeting with George Bush the previous March or April, I think.
He had one in April, and then there's the famous, there's a conversation that they have on the phone in July, and it's pretty clear that by then we were engaged in serious military planning. Clearly, the process of diplomacy to make this possible still needed to be gone through, the first and the second resolutions. But the idea that if the Americans were going to do this, the British were going to be with them, I think that was pretty much settled. The dossier, the infamous dossier, appeared about 2 weeks after I got there. I spent almost all my time on other things. So I never got into that dossier at all. So I think... Do
you think you should have done with a fresh mind? And you've got a naturally sceptical turn of intellect, which is what civil servants should have.
I don't think the Prime Minister was interested in fresh minds by that stage. I think that in the questioning I got in the Chilcot, particularly from Laurie Friedman, he seemed to think that I could step out on the road and say, hold on, shouldn't we stop this juggernaut? I think the juggernaut was well and truly rolling by then.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the War Cabinet. It wasn't a cabinet committee in the way that quite a lot of the war cabinets, in fact, they usually are, but it was definitely a war cabinet, and you were its secretary, its cabinet secretary.
I don't think I was its secretary. I think I would say the OD secretariat was it.
So it's David Manning and his group in the Cabinet Office.
Well, David Manning, of course, we have this dual or triple hatting that he becomes the Foreign Affairs Private Secretary number 10, the Foreign Affairs Advisor number 10, and he is the head of the unit, and an arrangement which has subsequently been criticised. But
so you looked after the full cabinet.
I think it would be someone like Desmond Bowen.
So you looked after the full cabinet, but the Prime Minister's group on Iraq was a different bit of the Secretariat. One of your people, but a different bit. Yes, not yes. Yes. Do you think you should have been Secretary of the War Cabinet in the way that Cabinet Secretaries in the past had been?
Well, what did Secretary of the War Cabinet mean in organising the meetings? There were very few papers. It was almost entirely done by very contemporaneous oral reports. John Scarlett coming in and giving a briefing.
The head of the JIC.
The military, Michael Boyce.
Chief of the Defence Staff.
Likewise, and then reports from the Foreign Office on where they were getting in the diplomatic.
Weren't you
effort.
anxious about that on the grounds that you do need a proper paper flow? I think Robin Butler's Privy Councillors Committee was quite critical about that. Good papers were written in the Cabinet Office, but they were not circulated. I mean, did you not worry about that? Because you're a good process man.
Well, the famous options paper, it was written back in, I think, March of 2002. Could have been shared more widely, but there was a very particular style by which the Prime Minister wanted to run this, and it wasn't a traditional Cabinet Office style. Now, when I made 2 appearances before Chilcot, the second one was on the same morning as Richard Wilson, and we covered some pretty similar ground. And what between us we were able to demonstrate was that this style of working was not a bad habit that the Blair group slipped into. It was a quite conscious decision. There are things that they had written in advance or reported ex post that they had been thinking that the civil service processes were too bureaucratic. You can see it all in the newspapers today. And they wanted something more streamlined.
There's dangers in that.
Absolutely, yes. And when you have an incident like the row with the BBC, David Kelly, very little was written down, and the one person that managed to construct a narrative for this and demonstrate that there was some rational purpose behind what the government had done was David Omond. None of the other participants were remotely interested.
And he'd taken a note for his own purposes. There wasn't a proper note taker.
Or else he'd done it, reconstructed from his own memory, yeah.
Do you regret that maybe this is not a question I should ask you, but do you think you should have actually said, wait a minute, this isn't the way to do it?
I think that they had their particular way of doing it. I don't think they were particularly interested in what the Cabinet Secretary thought on this.
Well, I think they should have been, Andrew. But that's not for me to say. I'm here to ask the questions, not to pontificate.
But even, I don't think, even in the period when Richard Wilson was Cabinet Secretary, I don't think he was involved to the extent that he might have been in earlier times.
I'm not a betting man, but I think once Chilcot has reported, in the future Cabinet Secretaries will be deeply involved in all that. I bet a bit of money on that.
Well, I think Chilcot will say that they should be. Whether they will be, history will tell us.
Let's move back now to public service reform, which is what the Prime Minister wanted you to concentrate on it. Is there something especially difficult about civil service reform? Is it the Mount Everest of challenges for those who would reform institutions in this country?
There's plenty that's difficult about it, and it isn't simply that civil servants are bureaucratic, risk-averse, or whatever. It is that public service is inherently difficult for 2 reasons. One is that almost by definition, the public service is providing those services which the private sector or families themselves cannot provide. So you're providing housing for the people who can't find their own housing, you're providing pensions and welfare. A bank can say, I can't make any money having a branch in a rundown inner city or in a rural area, they just close the branch. The government has to ensure that there is a payments mechanism that's operating nationally. So problems are inherently difficult, and a lot of the people you're dealing with, by definition, are people who don't want to be dealing with you, and they lie and cheat, and they don't. I mean, a lot of them are actually part of the kind of criminal world, or they have behaviour, antisocial behaviour that you don't approve of. Trying to change that is very, very difficult if they don't want to cooperate with you. The second is the lack of measurable outcomes. And I'll add a third, which is you have to bring together a lot of different considerations and weigh up the competing demands and produce some kind of trade-off for which there is no calculus that tells you what that trade-off is, and ultimately the trade-off is either political or it's a matter of equity. So it is inherently very, very difficult stuff to do.
So the civil service is, in many ways, is a sump into which the all too difficult problems fall that the private sector or anybody else won't touch.
It certainly has a great many of those that after the big change in the boundaries of the public sector, in the privatisation world, by definition, the government is left with those services that it is going to take responsibility for. And it then has what you might call a make or buy choice. Is it going to run those services using its own people, its own staff, or is it going to ensure that those services get delivered, but by co-opting, forming contracts with people from the private sector or even the third sector. Now, the NHS was formed on that basis in 1948. Half of it, primary care, hospital care, was done on the make basis. The hospitals were nationalised, the doctors became the employees of the state. The other half, the primary care, the dentists, the opticians, was on the buy basis, that you co-opted by a combination of sort of contract and their own ethics, people to serve the state's purpose. And the sector that you've spent your career in, the universities, are the same. They are not, these great universities are not state bodies, but they serve a state function. And making that choice is difficult, and making sure that you get the benefits of co-opting other people rather than simply using your own people, while at the same time having an adequate degree of control, is very difficult. The other area, which is based on, I think, is greatly influenced by Julian Legrand's thesis of knights and knaves, is how do you, what relationship do you establish with professionals? Do you treat them as knights who will do the right thing and serve their people because that's what they believe they're there to do? Or do you treat them as knaves who have a great deal of self-interest? And I think that by 97, the knave theory was probably in the ascendancy, and recognising that doctors, policemen, civil servants even.
Yeah, civil servants come into the knave category with some secretaries of state, don't they? Yes.
Many kind of fine characteristics, but definitely had own agendas and own interests. And left to themselves, had the educationalists delivered a top-class education system in this country? No. Left themselves, had the doctors produced a top-class health service? The answer was, it was pretty good, but it was capable of improvement. For example, the model of the doctor's surgery, where he sits in his office, which is usually where you're registered near your home, and you go to visit him in his place of work at times that he or she dictates. That's a case where they basically decide for themselves, well, what the right mode and standard of service is. And that needed to be challenged.
You believe in the knave theory then, do you?
No, I believe I'm somewhere in this spectrum, but I think I definitely do not believe in the knight theory, that I think all these suppliers of public services have their own vested interests. They want to deliver a good service, but very often if they want change, they want someone else to do the changing, and they'll stay with their particular
But there are
zone.
likely elements. I mean, you do believe in the public service impulse, don't you?
Well, I've spent many hours, and I've got more hours to come on the banking sector. And
oh, you're on the Parliamentary Commission, yes.
Their knavery has been pretty widespread. No, the answer is you've got to, both elements are present, but don't be starry-eyed that left to themselves you can give 100+ billion a year to the medical profession and say, do the best that you can with it, because they won't necessarily produce the answer, or they won't necessarily produce the change that you need.
Mm. On your watch as Cabinet Secretary Deliverer, what do you think my students in the future, historians of the future, will say, well, you can trace the Turnbull spore through here? Well, you shifted a bit of business.
I have to admit, I didn't invent delivery. I think delivery had contested paternity. The Treasury will say that they created this concept of public service agreements, that they had the comprehensive spending review, which says, here's your money, and when you got your brown envelope from Gordon Brown saying, here's your money, there was a whole list of, and here's what you are expected to deliver for it, and here's the huge number of reviews you've got to undertake, and so on. A rival version of this was developed in number 10. It started, this is under Michael Barber, that created the delivery unit.
It was Tony Blair's head of the delivery unit.
He ran, in effect, a pilot project for this in the Department of Education, working with David Blunkett, where certain aspects of the education system were specifically targeted. Numeracy and literacy and delivery plans were created to improve that. And it had, for a while, I think it had an effect, but it didn't last. It wasn't quite enough. And these two systems, for a time, there was a competition, and Gordon Brown was very worried that if you commit yourself to deliver X, the delivery unit would come along to the Prime Minister and say, we're falling behind schedule. You must get more money out of Gordon Brown to get us back on schedule. To be fair to Michael Barber, but it's also a shortcoming, I think, of the system. There is not a single pound sign in any delivery unit document. They are entirely about outcomes or intermediate outcomes. We want to reduce street crime, or we want to reduce asylum applications and increase asylum repatriations so that we reach a crossover. And you produce a plan to do that. And if things fell behind schedule, Michael did not go to the Treasury to ask for more money. He asked for a revision of the plan. And these two things then proceeded to coalesce. And the delivery unit was then placed where I think it really belongs, which is as part of the public expenditure side. Public expenditure side, the Treasury, should be doing three things: looking at the resourcing of the service, looking at the outcomes that the service is supposed to be producing, which was the kind of Barber delivery unit, and looking at the value for money, the costs of producing. Now, the value for money bit, up to 2004, value for money was very little consequence, and that was the thing I worked with Peter Gershon to begin the process of.
So you think that's your area where you really had a
well,
influence?
I think if you said, but what was the thing I had most influence on? This was the professionalisation of some of the functions in the civil service. The Mandarin class are basically recruited to be policy advisors, first of all, policy advisors and managers of government process. what then happens is that the HR director or the director of property or the director of finance is someone drawn out of that class. Very often, someone who's not actually thriving very much as a policy analyst is then taken on and put into one of these functions. Or occasionally, of course it's good for them, as Robin Butler did at the Treasury, you say, well, make him the establishment officer because it's all part of his kind of life's training. What didn't happen was, is say, we want, if you have a fully, really well-functioning organisation, the policy function has got to be top class. It's got to be, based on, proper evidence and challenge. But all the supporting services have got to be equally good. And so the people running finance have got to be more professional. The people running procurement or managing projects or HR likewise. And round Whitehall, a number of units were created in order to be the central point at which this development of professional skills could take place. But you couldn't do it everywhere. You'd spread yourself too thinly. So we had what was originally called the Office of the E-Envoy. Now this was a rather hubristic name because it implied that we know the truth and we're going to tell you benighted people out there that the E-era has come, whereas actually they'd got into the E-era before we had. So it eventually became the Office of the Chief Information Officer for Government, the Office of Government Commerce, which was to create a centre of expertise on procurement, but also to take over centrally the procurement of some major categories, energy or negotiating with the big IT suppliers, the shareholder executive and partnerships UK. And maybe there was one more of these we actually needed, but I think that plus this initiative called Professional Skills for Government was a very important way of raising the skills, not just in the traditional Mandarin Whitehall area, but the skills across the whole of the government department.
Can I ask you a very wide historical question now? The students always latch on to the old debate about prime ministerial power and collective cabinet power. Are you ever worried about the pressures on collective cabinet government? We have it at the moment because it's coalition and Mr Cameron said he wanted it anyway. The National Security Council and its apparatus is classically on that model. But you've seen many years and many prime ministers in operation here. There's always a difficulty with collective cabinet government, the desire to take shortcuts. Do you worry about that? Or do you think it's only old
in a way,
like
I'm
me?
surprised at just how much of it remains. If you look at the US system, there is something called the cabinet, but it doesn't work in the same way. There are a series of bilateral relationships with the president. They're all appointed by the president and have only one basis of power, which is the president has appointed them to
because they're not in the Congress, no.
They haven't been elected. They're not competitors in any sense. For the most part, I think the idea that you argue your corner, you get the best deal you can, you sign up to the outcome, and you then implement it, has survived. The only area where I would say it definitely hasn't survived is, do you go away afterwards and say, well, I didn't like that at all, and I wish we hadn't done that, through the memoirs process, which is a subject we've...
Or you leak.
Or you
leak.
But surprisingly, people do, in the end, make these political compromises. And the coalition is a sort of mass of compromises.
Are you a believer in collective cabinet government, though? Do you think it's important that we have that as the aspiration, even though people fall short all the time?
Yes, I think that what the Americans would call interagency cooperation is quite strong. I remember a story Nigel Wicks told me that when he was a Sherpa.
That was before the G7 summits.
Before the G7, when they were G7 summits.
Yeah.
His American counterpart in the US Treasury was sending things by telegram, in effect. And Nigel said, this, probably on the finances of Russia and how dire they were. And Nigel said to David Holford, "You shouldn't be doing this. This should be it's encrypted to the embassy and then the US embassy, and then they can bring it around here." And Holford said, "If it's a case of the Russians knowing or the State Department, I'd rather it was the Russians." And we by and large, the service, and that includes the Foreign Office, not technically part of the civil service, do see ourselves as part of a unified administration. And there are arguments, there are people, I'd say, Tony Benn, when he was at the Department of Energy, who try to run a policy which isn't the policy of the government. But if you look at how it compare with other countries, where often in a coalition, what happens is they don't just, they divide up the departments. So the Liberals look after this, or the Free Democrats look after that, or the Christian Democrats look after that. And here, all departments, their ministerial teams are all mixed up. And that is quite deliberate, because that is trying to maintain this belief in collective responsibility. So I think it is just how much of it is still operative, which is really the notable thing, rather than the opposite.
You served closely three very different prime ministers, either as private secretary, principal private secretary, number 10, or cabinet secretary. You must have a really good feel for how number 10 and the cabinet office, the central bits, reshape themselves to reflect the prime ministerial styles of government, their temperaments, their personalities, their priorities. How flexible is it, the centre of government, in those terms?
Well, again, it's also kind of how durable it is. You shouldn't underestimate the influence of geography. The fact that these ancient houses are used as the head of government reflects, in many ways, how the government runs. Is that other people that come here, when the Americans come here, or when the German Chancellor comes here, I think they're amazed at just the paucity of resources. I mean, I don't know what this building now accommodates, 300 people, say.
Are you putting that with the cabinet office?
No, with the cabinet office is, but that also creates an important distinction. This is why we talk about number 10 and we talk about the cabinet office. And Australia doesn't, and New Zealand don't. They talk about PMC, Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it's a single department. And in many ways, it should function like that. But there is this constraint which operates. So everyone who works here works under.
So you don't think we have a Prime Minister's department here that dare not speak its name? Units in the cabinet office.
I think we do have a Prime Minister's department that dare not speak its name. If a Prime Minister said, "I am renaming this Prime Minister and Cabinet Office," the cry would go up from people like you that the Prime Minister has annexed the Cabinet Office and stolen it from the collectivity.
Certainly would.
Whereas I took the opposite view, which is, if you emphasise the separateness of number 10, you run the danger that it will try to become self-sufficient, and it will fill this place with advice and won't go next door as often as it should do. And if you say that the cabinet secretary serves the cabinet and number 10 serves the prime minister, you're reducing the closeness of the relationship between the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister should turn to the Cabinet Secretary, almost as a kind of first port of call.
So you think this place should come out and say what it really is, in your view, that it is a Prime Minister and Cabinet Office?
Well, I think they are...
Or a Prime Minister's department.
I think
they should actually get through this fiction, as you're describing.
I think they're inseparable, because the Prime Minister cannot function without the Cabinet Office. And I always argued that if you set out the objectives of the Cabinet Office, the first one was not to serve the Cabinet, but to serve the Prime Minister as the leader of the Cabinet.
As Chairman of Cabinet, yeah.
So it is his cabinet, in a way, and he should be encouraged to make the fullest use of the resources that lie on the other side of the door.
Very interesting. Andrew, if a sixth former asked you, and he said, Lord Turnbull, or she said, what's the essence of the Cabinet Secretaryship, the key to doing the job? What would you say?
I would say it is making sure that the full resources available to government get deployed, and that the right people are in the room, that at the point a decision is made, the right information is available, and that the people who have a genuine interest in that subject are there, and that the decision then comes out of that. Its opposite is a series of decisions where Minister X comes to the Prime Minister and says, I want to do this. And he says, oh, it sounds all right to me. And then Minister Y comes in and says, yeah, but you realise what the effect of that is on my programme. Oh, says the Prime Minister, well, we better change it then. The answer is you've got to make sure that Prime Ministers on cabinets take decisions when they've got at the best time and when they are best equipped to take it. And you don't allow a series of bilateral, in a sense, premature decisions to get taken. So you have to harness these very considerable resources and not allow a series of shortcuts to take place.
So it's a combination of groundsman and umpire, to use a cricketing metaphor. Priming the pitch.
Yes.
And saying, you've got to do all this, otherwise it won't work.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit more than that. It's you've got to get the right people in the right place. So you're chairman of the selectors.
You're everything. Final question: if I was a newly appointed Cabinet Secretary, and in the gap between it being announced I was going to be and taking up the job, I would call on people like you, the old and the bold, who've done it before, and I would say, in your case, I'd say, well, in everybody's case, Andrew, tell me above all what I mustn't do in this job. Tell me about the pitfalls of being Cabinet Secretary. What would you say?
And I would say that you should try to understand what it is that ministers want, and as much as talking to the old and bold, you talk to those who have other relationships to the Prime Minister. What makes this guy tick? What really? How do you get the best out of them? What does he really dislike? So you actually understand what it is you're coming into, which is just as important as equipping yourself with the history of the ages.
So it's a matter of emotional geography as well as the physical geography of the layout or the history.
Yes. Yes. I mean, obviously, number one would be go and talk to Peter Hennessy, but
okay.
But finding out what is going on, what are the frustrations that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are feeling, so that you've got a good idea of what the problems are. So although you may have written the prospectus we talked about earlier, you shouldn't feel that, I've written the prospectus, that's what I'm here to do, this is my mission, because it isn't entirely your show. You are helping other people be successful in their show. That's
a kind of Jeeves-like interpretation of the job. No disrespect to Jeeves, he was a genius. From the neck up, he stood alone, as we know. It is a Jeeves description, though, isn't it?
It's slightly more than Jeeves, but the whole Woodhouse assumption is that Bertie is a numbskull, really.
Oh, we don't think that.
And that's, no, you should never...
No, we don't think that.
And politicians, the thing you have to remember is politicians aren't stupid. They have a different basis of legitimacy and a different accountability, and when a push comes to shove, their legitimacy trumps your legitimacy.
As a civil servant,
Yes.
Andrew, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.